Thank you, Tree. Thank you, Bob, for coming out. Yes, thank you, and also for the blurb. Yeah, Bob and I have a lot in common, actually. We're both from D.C., and we both have lived in poor countries in distant lands a lot in our sort of formative years. And where we part is that Bob, he attended the Iowa Writers Workshop, good for him, the famed Iowa Writers Workshop. And he has the National Book Award. That's also where we part. No, he spent many of his years in the Caribbean with the Peace Corps and as a journalist. And those experiences have informed his writing, including his first short story collection, Easy in the Islands, published in 1985, which received the National Book Award for first fiction. After a second collection of stories, The Next New World, in 1990, he published his acclaimed and magnificent 1993 novel, Swimming in the Volcano, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. In addition to fiction, Shacochis is an accomplished journalist and writer of nonfiction, whose work has appeared in countless magazines and newspapers. In 1994, he was sent to Haiti to cover the uprising against Aristide? There you go. And the subsequent invasion by the United States for Harper's Magazine. That experience gave rise to his first full-length work of nonfiction, The Immaculate Invasion, which is also out there for sale. His second novel, which was published last year, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, was released to rhapsodic reviews. Nancy Pearl has said it's the best book so far of this millennium, and it's truly an incredible, incredible book. I can't recommend it strongly enough. It's very, very intense and beautiful, and it's a really remarkable accomplishment. He's currently on faculty at Florida State University and Bennington College, and he is going to talk tonight about narrative time, a subject that is of great interest to me. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all about it. So let's please give a big round of applause for Bob.
Okay. I need my thing. Gee. Thanks, Tree and Hugo House, really, for bringing me here. It's so awesome to be doing something like this in a place like Seattle. And I should really just say, for my money, Seattle is the best literary town in America. Fuck New York. It really is. When I was on my book tour, I was here at the beginning of October. I was reading at Elliott Bay on a Friday night. Margaret Atwood was, I'm going to mix up the venues here. Margaret Atwood was reading like at City Hall or something. Paul Harding, Pulitzer Prize winner, was reading at the library or town hall, or I don't know, or Laurie King was reading somewhere. There was an event at Hugo House that night, and I thought, oh my God, that's Friday night in Seattle? That's pretty damn good. So I'm just happy to be here. Everything, the whole vibe of Seattle is so much better than the vibe in New York. And, you know, Amazon is always going to be, I'm going to always have ambivalent feelings about Amazon. But they're a big part of this town too. And, you know, just the whole atmosphere here is so much more digestible to me and what goes on in New York. And if Amazon's going to end up killing New York, well, it won't do me a bit of good, that's for sure. But I love Seattle, I really do. So I'm going to talk to you about time, which is a weird thing to talk about. And I got a lot of stuff up here. But I think I wanted to just preface it by before I start, well, here's the title, How to Wind the Clock of Your Days. And the subtitle is Notes on the Nature and Function of Time in the New Millennium. And before I actually start, delivering this lecture, I want to see if I can babble just for 30 seconds in a meaningful way by talking to you about the structure of the piece. The structural platform is 24 units. So we go from section 1 to section 2 all the way to 24. And since the topic is about time, 24 is a natural number to use, right? Greenwich Mean Time is based on the number 24, and military time is based on the number 24. Go from 0 to 24 each day and then start over again the next day. Civilian time, on the other hand, is not exactly 24, it's 2 sets of 12. And because my wife wanted to go shopping today, I didn't have a chance to get on WikiLeaks and find out exactly why civilian time is broken up into 2 sets of 12. But 12 and 24 are very significant numbers, whether you're a numerologist or not. And then I was reading in the New York Times last week this article in the science section. The title is, In the End, It All Adds Up to 1/12. I said, what? Okay, so this is what happens when you mess with infinity. You might think that if you simply started adding the natural numbers 1 plus 2 plus 3 and so on all the way to infinity, you would get a pretty big number. At least I always did. So it came as a shock to a lot of people when a pair of physicists purported to prove that this infinite series actually adds up to 1/12. Now, it's a mystery even to the scientist how they perform this, or why this comes out this way, but it keeps doing that no matter how many different approaches, mathematical approaches they have to trying to reach infinity. There's one approach, they do two approaches parallel to each other, and one approach actually does go on and on and on and on and on. But another approach always ends up at 1/12, 1/12. And they simply throw away the one that goes on and on and on and on and use the approach to fit to infinity that ends up at 1/12, and it always works. And they can use that to find out, because it's always reliable. The conclusion is inevitable, and they can use it to actually find out hard data about the universe. And as I was reading that, I was thinking, okay, so I have 24 sections in my piece, and that matches the platform for Greenwich Mean Time and military time. And then there's civilian time, which is 2 sets of 12. And then there's 1/12, which is actually representative of infinity. It's a mystery to these guys why it is, but it always works in the formulas. And I thought, well, that actually makes sense. If I had a blackboard back here, I would put this formula on it. Factor y plus 1/12 equals x. Actually, I have that backwards. X plus 1/12 equals y. Okay, so what's x? Infinite patience. What's 1/12? Well, that's the numerical value of the 12th man. So what's y? Winning the Super Bowl. Way to go, Seattle. Everything always works out in time, sooner or later. There's so many things to say about it. Most of them are scattered because everybody has something to say about time. And my own novels take 10 years to write, so I think in 10-year packets of time, or at least I operate in 10-year packets of time. And in this lecture, I'll be saying a bit about what people were saying at the end of the first decade in the 21st century, because that's when everybody suddenly had a bug up their ass about time. in our relationship with it. And it was also when Tim Egan, who I've never met, he is your New York Times columnist from Seattle, and I think the best columnist they have, had called in 2010, he said, we have just survived the lost decade. And that certainly resonated to the core of me. Anyways, how to wind the clock of your days. Notes on the nature and function of time in the new millennium. 1, get a dog. Kids will work for a while, especially when they're babies, going off like alarms right on schedule. But as they grow up, they become unreliable, begin to oversleep, and apparently lose their ability to tell time, or even pretend to harness a healthy respect for time's verities. Don't get a cat. Cats only acknowledge one setting on the clock, the food setting, but otherwise they don't give a shit about time. Don't get a monkey either. More specifically, what the writer John Griswold calls time monkeys. They are smiling and fanged. They wear fezzes. They chatter incessantly and pick at your clothes, creating all sorts of distractions and distortions. Good times become brief, and dental work eternal. Essentially, the monkeys work against hope, as when Griswold watched his 2 boys playing one evening and suddenly recalled his old G.I. Joe. Quote, "My faded youth saddened me," said Griswold, "and I wanted my toy back. But there's no distance so great as time," unquote. So get a dog, really, to wind the clock of your days. What happens, though, if the dog runs away, or worse, dies, like in Milan Kundra's The Unbearable Lightness of Being? Then time stops. And when time stops, you're either on psychotropic drugs, you're dead yourself, or you're very, very sad. Yet nothing on earth braids together the 2 fundamental strains of time in your personal universe with such tidy, eager harmony as a dog. 2, a problem with Kundra's novel. It made me cry as I recalled the deaths of my own beautiful clock-winding dogs over the years. This is not relevant because good books and arty things are not supposed to make a sophisticated, overeducated audience cry. This is relevant because it's common knowledge, or so I have reason to believe, that broken hearts cannot tell time. Broken hearts are blind and senseless to time, skewered on a cruel, white-hot spike of stopped time, writhing, oblivious to the count of the days. Because what's the point of counting when 1 never leads to 2, and 2 never flips ahead to 3, but it's just 1, 1, 1. 3. I'm thinking right now that 1, 1, 1 might very well be classified as a 3rd state of time. But essentially, there are just 2 types that we roll with: big, huge time and itsy-bitsy time. If you prefer fancier, more dignified names, try macro time and micro time, which are the terms I use in the classroom to try to explain this stuff. Or try some more comfortable nomenclature: cosmic time and real time. Although real time, at least as we encounter it on the page, is an illusion, and cosmic time is not. Both, strangely enough, have a paradoxical quality in which they can masquerade as the other. Big time can pass you by at the speed of light, and a moment in tiny time can occasionally stretch into a blissful or bloody eternity. Orgasms and car wrecks seem to share this capacity. 4. Perhaps like most of you, or some of you, or none of you, my schooling in these 2 types of time began before I was a writer. Specifically, when I left the country in 1973 at the age of 21 and ended up in the Caribbean, living and working with a spear fisherman by the name of Raimundo Lung. Years later, when I wrote about Mundo as a character in my short stories, I couldn't bring myself to give him a made-up name, because in life, Mundo was already larger than life. He was a genuine clairvoyant, not something that I easily acknowledged or readily accepted as a white kid from the suburbs. But Mundo was in the habit of falling asleep and dreaming, and when he woke up, he would share his dreams with the people around him, and the dreams would be prophetic. They would be about the future. And whenever he told me one of his dreams, the dream invariably came true. After I went away from the island where I lived with Mundo, I didn't see him again for 20 years. And when I finally saw him, his son smiled knowingly and said he and his father knew I was coming back soon because Mundo had dreamed my reappearance 2 nights earlier. "When was the last time you dreamed of me?" I asked Mundo. "I never dreamed of you in my life," he said, "until 2 nights ago." Don't think Mundo's prescience doesn't bewilder me, because it does. But it doesn't make me a cynic either. Hollywood and Toni Morrison like to tease us with magical Negroes, but I never saw Mundo as a magician or a sorcerer. He just lived more intimately with nature than anyone I've ever known. Living that close to nature apparently has its benefits. Perhaps your wiring connects with a different set of sensors attuned to a greater silence, and from within that silence, the emergence of voices you might not otherwise hear. Certainly, reading Ralph Waldo Emerson or Wendell Berry or Thoreau encourages this sensibility. 5. My life in the Caribbean as a young man was constantly pushing this information at me, that time has not one shape but 2, and its cosmic shape is amorphous, porous, filled with wormholes, popping up here and there and everywhere, everything happening all at once, past, present, and future. You might recall that Einstein, in his doodling days, had a similar vision of time, which came attached with 1,000 blackboards worth of chalky equations. It is the habitat of memory and hope in the kingdom of dreams. Einstein also observed that, quote, "the only reason for time is so that everything doesn't happen at once," unquote, which is what happens, you might have noticed, when we move beyond time. When everything happens at once, and I should say that Roger Cohen in the New York Times had a column a few months ago saying the end of time. The end of time is when everything happens at once. So, this is me again. When everything happens at once, both our institutions and our culture seem to contort with the schizophrenia. There are no beginnings and no middles and no ends. Time's other shape, though, chronology, is a donkey, a beast of burden, plodding forward inevitably at the steadiest rate, 1 foot in front of the other, minute after minute, day after day. The writer can choose to be Mundo or choose to be the donkey, but if the writer chooses to be both, which is actually a normal state of affairs, the writer better be a master of the craft of artful, coherent, graceful transition between big time and little time, or the writer will fail. 6. There are also 2 fundamental types or states of existence: flesh, or matter, and the second one is words, parentheses, or ideas, emotions. We're told that in the beginning was the Word, which means in the beginning, there were ideas outside of time. That's what words are. And then somehow the Word was made flesh. And flesh, as you know, is a hapless prisoner of time. So the question arises, is time structure or just a relentless stringing together? Structure being an entity implicit with meaning, and stringing together being an activity implicit with coincidence, meaningful or not. Is it possible to relate this basic dynamic of our life in the cosmos to a publishing problem? Yes. Yes. More about that in a minute. 7. During the first information revolution, when prehistory became history around 3400 BC in ancient Sumeria and Egypt, the first attempts to make language visible, to make language written, had little to do with time except in its most static form, recording the death of a king or the birth of a child or the date of a battle. Mostly, writing was accounting, a function of commerce and the marketplace. 20 units of wine, 30 goats, 16 slaves bought or sold in my master's house. And by the way, we count as the Babylonians did, using 60 fingers for seconds and minutes. Writing as a carrier of narrative, meaning writing as a vehicle for containing the orderly passage of time, did not evolve for another 700 years until the Sumerian epic tale of Gilgamesh and the ancient flood. And also by that time, by the way, time-wise, the Quran gets the story of the deluge right, and the Bible doesn't. As a matter of fact, whoever was keeping time in the Old Testament must have been drunk. And you would know that from reading Genesis, the very first book. But starting with Gilgamesh, to tell stories, human beings had to invent a different, more plastic way of thinking about time. In short, they had to formally, consciously manipulate time, which primarily meant to shrink it, to condense it, without screwing up its credibility, its verisimilitude. Time, for the first time, became a deliberate artifice. And without that evolution, literature would not be literature, but some exhausting and unrealistic attempt at documentary. What I mean to say is, and I just realized that exactly is a metaphor for this idea that infinity all adds up to 1/12. Because they work with two different systems. One is never ending. Like the documentary would be never ending if you wanted to get it totally representative. And the other, using a different approach, puts you at a place. Why 1/12? I don't know, but it at least has closure. Documentary, unless it's artifice, can really never have closure, right? Or, well, any closure is artificial. What I mean to say is, once the limitations of real time were set aside, cosmic time was invited in as a partner in the storytelling. 8. Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Life is not what one lived. Life is not what one lived, really? Yeah. Life is not what one lived, but what one remembers and how one remembers it in order to recount it. Translation, life reflected is not found in real time, but cosmic time. 9. In the early 1990s, I spent about 18 months on and off in the field in Haiti, chronicling the invasion of the island by the U.S. military. When I turned in my manuscript to my editors at Viking, and there were a bunch of them, their response was that this was not the book they had been counting on me to write. We were expecting a policy book, they told me, and were very disappointed. I had delivered to them a literary narrative. I had given them flesh in time when what they wanted was ideas, unanchored from time, except in the way time can be used as a marker, referring to other markers, but not integral to a cause and effect pattern of meaning the way time functions in a story. Within a very short time of its publication, Viking knocked the book out of print, and I decided to write, or withdraw into, is another way of saying that, a novel for the next 10 years, where I imagined I could have my way with big and little time, utilizing them, exploiting them, as I fancied, without being kicked in the seat of my pants by editors. 10. How not to sell a memoir. 4 years ago, or maybe 5, the wonderful writer Deborah Monroe, down in Texas, finished a memoir on the outskirts of Normal about being a single white woman in southwest Texas who adopts an infant black female. Deborah's my friend. She sent me the manuscript. I knew she had gotten rid of her ineffectual agent, and I suggested she send the manuscript to a well-known New York agent who represents, name-dropping, Michael Cunningham and Scott DeRoe and Julia Glass and so on and so forth. The agent loved the manuscript, but said no one at the New York City publishing houses would ever publish it because it had a non-linear timeline. And publishers believe that no matter how well a memoir is written, non-linear timeline means no sale because New York publishing houses think readers in America are too fucking stupid to follow a non-linear timeline. Deborah, rather than jamming the narrative into a straight chronology, had let her memory write the book. And as you know, memory and emotion work organically in macro time, dipping out in and out of real time like a hummingbird to create scenes, vignettes, anecdotes as needed to create a more subtle narrative integrity. She tried and tried to revise the book according to the agents and the publisher's parameters. 2 years later, it was qualitatively a better book, but the timeline still had its bends and twists and loops in it, and it was rejected by the people known as the best editors at the places known as the best houses. I helped her find another agent who was, for personal reasons, absolutely enthralled by the memoir's subject. There was a genuine connection between the agent's family life. She had a sister who had adopted she was white. Sister who had adopted a small black infant. So there was this genuine connection between the agent's family life and the narrative of Deborah's book, but same story. Timeline is too confusing for a general audience. Read the book, though, which was published by SMU Press and praised by critics, and that's the last thing you would feel, that the timeline is difficult to follow. What's the moral of this story? I find it too depressing to even think about. 11. So, hey, do you think the way I've structured these remarks is phallocentric? Jab, jab, jab. If I didn't structure these remarks but just let them fly, would you think that was somehow effeminate? Is it possible that I both structured these remarks and simultaneously let them fly? Is there something about the sun rising in the morning and setting in the evening, day after day, that you find too linear and simplistic and banal? Is there something about remembering the sunset from 5 years ago as you drink a glass of wine watching tonight's sunset that's too confusing to you? 12. Charlie Baxter, in his New York Review of Books essay on Franzen's most recent novel, I have written here Jonathan Franzen, but isn't it amazing we could say Franzen and, everybody knows. You can't do that with my name. In his essay on Franzen's most recent novel, Freedom, asserts that Franzen is a writer of great patience. This is his glory and his curse. A few lines later, Baxter says, readers like David Shields, we've been friends for 30 years, by the way, David and I, and have fought wonderfully for those 30 years. Readers like David Shields, whose time sense is more irritably prone to aesthetic boredom, have found Franzen's novels to be too slow, too filled with experiences to reflect contemporary life. Franzen has a voluptuous sense of time that reminds Baxter of 19th century English and Russian novelist. Franzen himself in the novel seems to speak directly to critics like Shields. Here's the excerpt. Quote, "It's the same problem everywhere. It's like the internet or cable TV. There's never any center. There's no communal agreement. There's just a trillion little bits of distracting noise. We can never sit down and have any kind of sustained conversation. It's all just cheap trash and shitty development. All the real things, the authentic things, the honest things are dying off," unquote. 13. Our perception that we have no time is one of the distinctive marks of modern Western culture. That was said by a woman, and I don't know who she is really, Margaret Visser, but I attribute her quote because that's the right thing to do, but I don't know where I found the quote. Okay, never mind, talking to myself. I'll just say it again. Our perception that we have no time is one of the distinctive marks of modern Western culture. So, okay, Mr. Einstein, if it is our perception that we have no time, is it also our perception that everything is happening at once? Or is everything really happening at the same time? 14. Maybe time is one of those real, authentic, honest things that are dying off. The smartest insight I heard anybody say at the turn of this current decade, when all the commentators were being asked in 2010, what do you think about the last 10 years? Smartest comment came out of the mouth of Leon Wells, I can't pronounce his name, the guy at the New Republic, Leon W., the literary editor of the New Republic, in a commentary published in the New York Times that attempted to come to terms with the first lost decade, and that's Tim Egan's term, lost decade, of the 21st century. Quote, "Attention deficit disorder is no longer a disorder in America. It is the norm. Attention is now the disorder." End of quote. Okay, everybody's favorite New York Times columnist to hate, Tom Friedman, still sometimes has some things to say. He colored in this pathology, quote, "We become absorbed by short and shorter term thinking, from Wall Street quarterly thinking to politician 24-hour cable news cycle thinking. We're all day traders now. We have day thinking politicians trying to regulate day trading bankers, all covered by people tweeting on Twitter. The paradox is, of course, that the faster we stuff our heads with the information, the less we care about that information, and the quicker we devour it, forget it, and move on, which would be perfectly fine if we were a plague of locusts and information was an endless crop of corn. Eat, 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 die." 16. This is Sam Anderson. "It would be hard to dispute that writing in 2010 too, it would be hard to dispute that over the last 5 or 10 years, the culture's relationship to time has changed pretty drastically. The shift is so obvious that it's boring by now, even to name the culprits. And of course, it is boring. They still have to be named. Google, blogs, tweeting, texting, iPhones, Facebook, a little army of tools that have given rise to and grown out of radically new habits of attention. Many of us are now addicted on the dopamine receptor level to a moment-by-moment experience of life that's defined by a behavior sometimes referred to as time slicing. Jumping every few seconds between devices or windows or tabs, constantly swiveling the periscope of our attention around and around the horizon to see where the latest relevant data burst might come from. Translation: we all now reside in the land of crazy fuck. I just have to ask. I mean, it's pervasive in our culture. It's pervasive in the world too. Where did this permanent sense of urgency come from? Where you fucking have to know, and you have to know right now. Where did that come? Why do you? Because you never cared before, and now it's like I really have to know. and of course you don't. I mean, you can. I've always been a news junkie. It's been part of my profession and my livelihood to know as best I could what's going on. But now everybody has to know. And when as soon as they find out, it's like, yeah, fuck that. Okay. All right. We have a problem, Houston. 17. When time gets out of control, here's the deal. Stories fracture into incoherence, and a culture starts to dissemble from the center. I don't really care if accelerated time, spinning and flailing time, time smashed into a million bright splinters, is an accurate reflection of contemporary life. I prefer to play the fool, whether in King Lear or on Comedy Central, the agent whose role it is to hit the pause button and trick the players into reflection. Sanity and meaning cling to time, big and little, both of which have a natural rhythm that provides a basic component for our humanity. When a writer nurtures this sensibility, when she reaches out and gathers up and weaves together the fullness of time, something marvelous happens as real time and cosmic time seem to meld into a single unit. I'm thinking here of Jennifer Egan and her marvelous novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad. Also of Paul Harding and his lovely novel, Tinkers. And Paul will tell you, don't forget his influence, As I Lay Dying, from Faulkner, of course, or Fuentes' Terra Firma, or The Death of Artemio Cruz. All those novels have such a powerful blend of big time, little time, or you can say inner time and external time, internal time, external time, cosmic time, real time. They all do it beautifully. 18. The last time I lectured at the Bennington Writing Seminars on the occasion of my 60th birthday, I spoke about the making of an American writer, specifically me. And I think an anecdote from that talk bears repeating. The math I conjured for the audience was simple, in its simplicity, breathtaking. 4 times 60, my age, right? 4 times 60 equals 240. Let me explain the profound significance of these numbers. Imagine this. The topography of Northern Virginia, where I grew up, rises westward from where the Potomac River slides past Washington, D.C., toward a ridge about 25 miles out of town. And if you stand on that ridge on a clear day, you can look northeast down Route 50 and Dolly Madison Boulevard, all the way to the rooflines of the Capitol, and turn and look west to the nearby skyline of the Blue Ridge Mountains. On July 21st of 61, the ridge was lined with cannon of the Army of Northeastern Virginia, aimed at nearby meadows and farmland surrounding a place called Manassas Junction, cut through by a small river named Bull Run. Perhaps 100 yards from the long row of cannons stands a Confederate drummer boy, dressed in butternut trousers and gray blouse and forage hat squashed on his head. He is 10 years old, terribly excited. And when the artillery batteries fire the opening salvo of the first major battle of the war, the drummer boy is permanently awestruck by the shattering thunder of the rounds and the howls of armies hurtling themselves toward one another. He has never witnessed anything more spectacular or thrillingly grand in all his life, and he believes he never will again. But the year is not 1861, it's 1961, and the drummer boy is me, costumed out for the centennial reenactment of the first Battle of Bull Run. What I remember most from that day, besides the sinister magnificence of the cannonade, is my father leading me into a circle of rebel soldiers to meet at its center 3 old-timers who looked like grizzled Santa Clauses. A century before, their own fathers had fought in this very war, the war between the states, and my father nudged me forward to shake their hands. It's a tableau I feel a great reverence for. A child of Camelot, me, raised inside the Beltway, shaking hands with the children of our nation's greatest tragedy. Add 2 more generations to this equation, one a very small child and one a very old man, and you've time traveled right this instant through flesh back to an America that had yet to produce its revolution. 240 divided by 4 equals me. The duration of my own life has thrust this revelation upon me. I have finally understood the youth of our country's youthfulness, and have finally understood that in many ways I have lived in lockstep with that youth, and that it's over. And you know when it ended. You were all alive when it ended. 19. We're not indulging in magical thinking here. A writer named Robert Krulwich cataloged this taffy-pull phenomenon of personal historical time, little time and big time, recalling in his NPR blog how in 1973, in a Brooklyn deli, he struck up a conversation with an old man who had grown up in St. Petersburg, Russia during Tsarist times. And the old man's neighbor had been the mad monk Rasputin, who was assassinated in 1916. There are people who live long enough, Krulwich wrote, to create a link, a one-generation link to figures from what feels like a distant past, and their presence among us shrinks history. The blogger Jason Kotke likes to collect examples of what he calls human wormholes, people who help us leap across space and time. These examples, at least for somebody like me, my sensibilities, they blow my mind. For instance, Samuel Seymour, when he was 5 years old, was in the theater that night and witnessed the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And in 1956, Seymour was interviewed on television about his memory of that event. How about this? To me, this is the most astonishing one. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes lived long enough to shake hands with both presidents, John Quincy Adams and John F. Kennedy. That's how young our country is. President John Tyler, born in 1790, has 2 grandsons who were still alive in 2012. 3 Civil War widows lived into the 21st century, even collecting the pensions of their husbands, veterans of the Confederate Army. A few months ago, I was listening to NPR, and the interviewer asked an elderly gentleman how old he was. "I'm 82, replied the man, "but a year and a half ago, I was 21. I love that response, and for me it resonates beautifully with something Picasso once said: it takes a lifetime to become young. Notice Picasso didn't say young again, and I doubt very much he was referring to the stage in life where you go to Walmart and buy adult diapers. The elasticity of time, so available, so intimately accessible, seems to me to contain some elemental code that might help us understand what it means to be an American. Yet I find it odd that many, or most, I don't know if it's many or most, or contemporary American writers seem to shy away from it, or at least isolate it into well-wrapped packages. Historical novels, futuristic novels, I like them both, but novels of the moment, for the moment, by the moment, there's nothing wrong with that, but where's the sweep? And the internal sweep as well as the external. The stretch, the intermingling, the liberation from convention. Is it there? It's not just about memory either, because you can't have a future unless you invite the future into the present. This is precisely what's wrong with our political system today. You can't have a future unless you invite the future into the present. And that's the same on the page. That's the same in a story. 20. This is Stephen Byrne. Seated on the cusp of the network revolution, the critic Sven Burkitz cataloged the losses that a reader in the electronic millennium would suffer. Divorce from historical consciousness, a fragmented sense of time, a loss of deep concentration. From the other side of the divide, these positive things, the ability to locate a cluster of like-minded people must seem a real gain to the reader who finds isolation uncomfortable rather than one of reading's fertile preconditions. Yet, however the economy of costs and benefits is calculated, the change in technology that organizes the audience changes the rest of the writing world. Some writers may try to seal themselves off from the crackling energy of the web, but the contemporary novel's form is always a model of the way our minds work. And it registers the deep changes in the ways we process data. A contemporary novel offers an opportunity to measure fiction's mutating forms, to note perhaps the dominance of time as a thematic obsession in the works of the last 20 years, or the emergence of the family epic. 21. I guess it's about time I talked about The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, the novel I began in 2002 and finished in December of 2011. As I've said elsewhere, in parentheses, note, I'm a hearty practitioner of the faux crime of self-plagiarism, unquote. The book is a monster, almost 900 pages, set on 3 different continents with 4 separate but interlocking chronologies, each backdropped by a different war, with, I'm sure, more than 10, but I think less than 50 characters. It's not that I've forgotten the number. I've never counted the characters in my book. Why would you do that? I was on some TV Good Morning show in Florida, and the anchor said, "Good morning, Bob. How many characters are in your book?" And I said, "I don't know." It was like, you know, these morning shows, there's the guy and the babe. The guy said, "How many characters are in your book?" I said, "I don't know. I've never counted them." He said, "That's ridiculous. How can you never count them?" I said, "Well, look, this isn't a very big building, this television studio. How many people work in this building?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "You come here and work every day. How many people are in this building?" "I don't know." Well, and then the babe gave him one of these. He got you. I mean, why do we need to know how many people work here? Except for the person who writes the check. It's for everybody. Okay, it doesn't matter. Excuse me. We'll go on. When I finished the book, the manuscript spent the next 6 months in the hands of 2 very excellent editors, one a professional paid by my publishers, the other a friend and former student of mine who asked to read my final draft and just went ahead and edited the damn thing in a most brilliant fashion. He now is a professional editor himself after he just did that as an act of friendship. Both editors had their own ideas about how to trim some of the tonnage off the beast, yet they both surprised me by agreeing on one issue that I didn't see coming. They wanted to delete any sentence that violated standard operating procedure for chronology. For instance, a sentence like this: "That New Year's Eve was the last time he ever danced with his mother, who 2 years later would succumb to pancreatic cancer." Gotta go, they said. Or this: "The next time Dottie Chambers saw Tom Harrington in another time and place, he would understand that what had happened between them and Haiti had been no accident." Both sentences, as you can see, invite the future into the present and past, and thus allow themselves in the consciousness of the voice, a more expansive sense of time. For me, it's mostly a voice question. and you could say voice/consciousness. Mostly a voice question. I like what happens to the sound of a sentence when the breeze of the future ruffles the language. Neither editor, however, had much tolerance for the technique. Wow, I told them. It's a good thing you guys didn't edit A Visit from the Goon Squad, a novel in which individual scenes have their dramatic payoff, but the power of the aggregation of the scenes depends entirely upon the author's sensibility about time, big and little, and how she integrates them in these huge, marbled, convoluted loops throughout the book. 22. So this is a conversation between me and one of those editors. Editor, because I complained, imagine that. So we're having a conversation. Editor, I'm reading Goon Squad 2, and stand by my assertion that I don't have a knee-jerk reaction to flash forwards, just a certain kind of flash forward. Me. Oh, well, if she's doing the flashing better than me, that cuts me hard. Editor, she does a different thing entirely. I think what I was cutting from your book was those teaser flashes. All that stuff about what would eventually go down up north in the plotting. And I just said, cut it back, not cut it all together. That kind of stuff you have an that kind of stuff has to have an exceedingly light touch with, or it feels like you're dragging the reader along by his nose. And more to the point, your narrative already had mucho momentum without the flash forwards. Jennifer's flashes aren't teasers, aren't related to suspense or momentum. They're, I don't know, building a sense of tragedy or pathos or something. Me. Her flashes are, I'm going to coin a word here, chronothematic. Her structural sensibilities mirror mine, the eternal present, which contains both the past and the future. Although it's true, and you're right, that many of my flash forwards were teasers, and I'm sure some of them were just thrown in to remind me where the fuck I was supposed to be headed. Here are 2 excerpts from the novel where the chronothematic pop right out of the narrative. This is from my novel. The first takes place when my 17-year-old protagonist visits the home in Ephesus, Turkey, where Mary, the Virgin Mary, Mother of Christ, where Mary spent the rest of her life after her son was crucified. And what I wanted to demonstrate is a time that can visit the past, but it's still chronological and it's still external, even though she's having thoughts about the past. Okay, so here's the section. A busload of Muslim tourists disembarked, a preponderance of women in headscarves and black raincoat dresses, whom she trailed down the walkway into the pines, the air laden with golden motes. Her body began to respond, feathery shivers of electricity absorbed in her chest, some ancient lingering energy flowing up and through the limbs of her spirit, tendrils of holiness like climbing vines. Her heart felt gripped by this modest stone cottage ahead in the trees, a hut really, a woodcutter's shelter, a place to hide from the world, where St. John had brought the Virgin away from the unforgiving barbarity of Jerusalem. These mortared walls and this lovely forest where Mary ate her bread and studied the dome of stars, wrestling with the miracle of her child, and finally died from so much yearning. In everything she looked at, she perceived a mystical shimmer that could only be the mingling of auras, hers and Mary's. Their feet on the same ground, the baked fragrance of pine needles the same, century after century, their ears buzzing with the same isolation, the Virgin's parched throat cooled from this sacred spring whose water Dorothy now drank from the cup of her hands. How could she have possibly foreseen what was being asked of her, what she had gotten herself into? Had she been carefully chosen, or had it been like, okay, you, one womb as good as the next to carry light into the world? And whatever miracle could make that happen, Dorothy thought, if a virgin has a baby, he better be the Son of God. Her father had told her this. God sent his Son to experience time, the Achilles heel of creation, known only through the tribulations of mankind. The virgin birth was meant to establish the bridge back across the cosmic chasm, time's correction. Understand? The universe was not whole until Mary, the mother of our completion. Dorothy was still a child when her father told her this, and she had failed to comprehend why God didn't just have the baby himself. Why trouble poor Mary? And when she was older and more understanding, Dorothy wondered skeptically, wait, did God rape Mary? Which is when she stopped going to confession, afraid to confess the mortal sinfulness of such a thought. So that's the first example. And it is in real time. The events are going forward on the tick of the clock, and she is meditating on the past. Until you bring in the future, you don't really have cosmic time or consciousness on the page. What you have is a very intelligent young woman having real-time chronological experiences and reflecting on them. But now here's something different. The second excerpt is 10 years later, and Dorothy's on the beach in North Carolina. She's been caught in dangerous surf, and her head has been smashed into the bottom by a huge breaking wave. And she's soon going to wash up on the beach. She was being tumbled again, not by water, but by time, which made no sense. To be time's prisoner and yet not. To be outside as well, beyond the burden of chronology, oblivious to the count of days, where time was amorphous, porous, popping up here and there and everywhere, everything happening all at once. I am naked and lying on the beach, she told herself, but she was aware of an impossible connection. There was one beach, but not one now. The trick seemed to be time itself. You could think this way, but it was not real to be this way. I'm lying on the beach, she insisted, but something's broken, something's wrong. How do I fix it? What do I do? Oh, she said with great relief, I get it. I'm dreaming this incredible dream, and Evel was inside of her. They were nuzzling, smeary with sweat. The taste of him salty as she licked his chest. Then she was poised to come, and she was almost there, and then she was there, her orgasm running like a shiver through the timbers of a ship. Wow, she thought, opening her eyes. If that wasn't real, then... But it was too real, the walls of her vagina swelling shut with pleasure. She could see the sky again, the vestiges of the storm clearing off, and she had one of those rogue memories that didn't fit, which seemed to skip ahead. Evel telling her he didn't know how to love her, and she asking, why are you taking so long? And Ev laughing, saying sweetly, I guess I've run out of options. I'm lying on the beach and I'm dreaming, or I'm dead, she thought. Prescient, clairvoyant, hallucinating, delirious, insane. Then a compulsion to pray became irresistible, and she found herself in a familiar sanctuary, kneeling in St. Luke's out in Langley with her family. St. Luke's is the church I attended as a kid. It's the closest Catholic church to the CIA. It's the CIA's Catholic church. Kneeling in St. Luke's out in Langley with their family, the church packed with a congregation of families much like hers, the ossified OSS crowd, and the graying Cold War crowd, and the new crowd, and her crowd, the spiritually slothful and the divine firebrands, and she bowed her head and prayed, Dear God, I want them all dead. But a modern person could not pray for this. Pray for enlightenment and tolerance. Pray for democracy and justice. Pray for her father's salvation. Lord, forgive me. I am a deadly wayfarer, the means by which sin enters this world, the vessel willing to carry forth the corruption. Is it true, Lord, only angels can fight the devil? Has that worked well for you, Lord? I stand and face your enemy. What shall you have me regret? My Father, Father? Where is the time for that? Would you replace my hate with nihilism, O Lord? What shall you have me sacrifice? But it was never a question of how far she'd go. Kill them all, she prayed and paused, reconsidering a possible correction, a potentially definitive flaw in her understanding. Perhaps a soul is what you have spent your life making, not a piece of metaphysical equipment shipped ready-made from the factory, another myth like original sin, which you were outfitted with at birth and could somehow lose, like men high and low somehow lost their humanity. And so she prayed then that no God was listening. She prayed she hadn't been heard. At last she prayed, we must be patient until love turns. Amen. The sun broke through the clouds to stay and warmed her body, and the water began to retreat, and she wanted to rise, but for some reason could not until Evel Burnett, dependable Burnett, the good soldier, came to her rescue. I'm here, he said, and stooped to take her hand. I was waiting for you, she said. You found me. Let's get you up, he said, and she never felt more grateful in her life or properly loved than when he pulled her up and they walked on, the headwinds fresh and ever-lessening, the world receding in their wake, faded into haze. I wanted to read you this excerpt because every single word of it takes place in cosmic time. And for me, psychologically, emotionally, thematically, existentially, the novel ends right here on page 666. What's that about? Although the narrative continues for 46 more pages, and those pages are all in real time. I had no choice but to write those 46 extra pages, but they're for the reader, to fulfill the reader's expectations, to let the reader know what happened, to let time play out for these characters, real time, chronological time. But for me, the book ends when Evel Burnett picks up Dorothy Chambers from where she's sprawled in the sand, and where she has just, her consciousness has all three elements of time working, so she's in cosmic time. And so he picks her up from where she's sprawled in the sand, and they walk together down the beach into a haze. It's an emotionally true moment and a cosmically true moment, but it's experientially false, or at least aborted. Okay, so my book gets edited, and finally we agree, okay, that's the edit, and then it goes to a copy editor. The first thing the copy editor wanted to do was change my dedication. Like, you want to change my fucking dedication? I will kill you. Get away from my dedication. And then when she got to this section I just read to you, she said, over the top, you should cut this whole thing. And I said, I didn't say it to her because I don't talk to crazy people if I can't help it. But I said to my editor, you know, that to me that is the end of the book. It's the real end of the book for me, and it's the best writing I have in the book. And why in the world would I ever cut it if she can't understand it or what's going on there? That's okay. She's just the fucking copy editor. And she's way too big for her britches, but that's okay. Maybe she will rise on to being a real editor and drive writers really nuts. Anyways, that's what's going on there. I'd like to tell you more about that scene, but I'd be, you know, if you read my book, you and I can talk about it face to face, but to the audience, I don't want to do that if you haven't read the book, because something happens there. There's a foreshadowing there. She's experiencing something there. And I make it because she hit her head. But sometimes I guess you need a way to open the door. That's not just stream of consciousness. A way to open the door where cosmic time has the full weight of real time. And she is prescient, at least for that moment. And I think, I think we're all prescient, but we just don't know it. And I wouldn't be surprised if we all really somehow, I'm getting crazy, but that's okay, I'm almost done. So I can slip in a little craziness here. I wouldn't be surprised if we all do have premonitions of our death in some way. The thing is, we never get to say, oh my God, I had this total premonition of how I'm dying right now, because you're dying right now. We never can confirm it to anybody. Well, I had this premonition in 1982, and this is exactly how I'm dying. You can't really tell anybody that because you're dead. But I think that, well, never mind. 23. Here's another example of what I mean about the consciousness and sound of a voice being chronothematic. This is an excerpt from an essay about swimming by Sven Berkitz, and I love this essay so much, it's a small piece of it. But he's doing the same thing here that I just did in that passage I read, in terms of how he's operating with time, the elements of time. Okay, this is it. Maybe this is why I've never really written about swimming before. I find just too many layers bound up with too many different things. It goes so far back. Long before there were pools and meets, there were the years at Walnut Creek, starting with the earliest times of growing up, and then later the period when my father thought he would train me and turn me into a competitor. All these phases are still somehow with me every time I take that first time obliterating plunge. To fix on this timelessness feeling is paradoxical. I realize, given how much of my swimming was for years about the opposite, about clock time, getting through whatever distance as quickly as possible. But this is not the swimming that matters anymore. Though the memories of that still haunt with every stroke, what matters is the other, the lake and the pond swimming, when I can feel my whole existence peeling away from me. I felt it again just this morning. I set my glasses aside, waded a few feet into the shallows, and then dove. All time, no time, everything just silvery, bright bubbles and light and skin sensation. And every stroke I took after I reached the surface again was just a coda for that. 24. In Greek mythology, Kronos was the god of time. And I see him reincarnated here in Berkitz's essay. A young swimmer leaving the shore, his strokes like clockwork, the rhythm a type of mantra. We're starting. And that same swimmer, now an old man, returning to shore, the rhythm the same, but the mantra different. We're finishing. Or I imagine Kronos morphed into a version of himself more recognizable by David Shields, a shaven-headed and tatted up god, fond of crystal meth, surfing the channels at a rate measured in nanoseconds. Or Jennifer Egan's Kronos, commanding a goon squad, of course, dressed in black ninja pajamas, kicking down your door at midnight. Time's up, folks, and everybody knows timing is everything. My Kronos is a holy trinity of dogs, Petey, Emma, and Sissy, each born knowing how to wind the clock of my days. They keep time perfectly, big time and little time, and as a favor of love, they keep me from getting lost in time. They really do. Who wants to get up right now and go for walkies? Thank you.
Can we cue the first the Powers slide? Richard
Are
Powers.
you kidding me?
No, I swear to God, here we go. This is how it goes. We're gonna kind of zip through some of this because we're gonna try to move quickly. But Richard Powers, the novelist who spent his teen years in Thailand, said up there, this is on KUOW last week, although I did return to the States and the Midwest at 16 after spending years in Thailand, it was this experience, this collision with an entirely different language and way of thought that made my own country seem strange to me. Coming back as a teen and now being an outsider led to writing in the sense of never again being a complete participant in a culture. but always a bit on my own shoulder and observing from the outside. And I think it was that split, that double life, that inclined me to being an observer in a way that leads to a writer's sensibility. I personally had a similar experience, and I wonder if you did too, through the Peace Corps, and I wonder to what extent that has been a sort of trigger for you. I know your writing is, you know, mostly expat writing, right?
Yeah.
It is.
Well, I mean, my mind is going in its own direction from reading the quote here. And my first internal impression from reading this quote is this could be a soldier writing who's just coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan. Once you go overseas and start experiencing a different reality, and it's a very insulated reality with the military and soldiers that's interrupted by the most unimaginable violence. But it's a different world. And once you move beyond your own culture to another culture and begin to see other ways of life, even if you don't admire or value those other ways of life, something really important has happened in your consciousness, and that is you understand the world is bigger than what you thought it was before you crossed the border. Once you cross that border, two things happen. One is you know more than you wish you knew, and three things really. You know more than you wish you knew. Wherever you went, you took America with you, so you never really could get away from it. And number three, the biggest culture shock of all is America. Coming home to America, where you understand for the first time in a way you never could have before, unless you went to a war zone, a third world country, an emerging market, which is such corporate speak, and so is such a great on-target reflection of the way this country thinks these days. It's power structures. You're now an emerging market. You're not the third world anymore. And most of those emerging markets we raped long ago. And if we didn't get them, Europe got them in the last century and the century before that. But coming back to America is where the real culture shock experience happens, I think. It's not so weird to end up in the jungle in Africa in a primitive place and seeing something that you more or less had some idea that was out there, as mythological as it might have seemed, but now you're seeing it. And you're seeing, my God, humans are living in a way that's like 1,000 years ago. Or they're living in a way in such poverty, but they still seem like good people and decent people and happy people. How can they do that in such poverty? Coming back to America is where everything starts to scramble in your sense of feeling at home in the world. And you're coming home to your own country, and all of a sudden, you've lost your sense of being at home.
The character at the center of the book, the woman who is in the title, who goes by various aliases, is a person of many countries in a way, and she is a person of many faces. And to me, the great, kind of the most devastating and powerful aspect of the book is this woman's arc throughout the book, the way she changes, or our perception of her changes. She is a chameleon, as a person who hops through cultures, often ends up being, in a sense, that she sort of chooses versions of herself to be present in various states. And she's sort of an operative herself. But at the opening of the book, she appears to be kind of flattened, and she's a kind of sexualized character, and then she develops these sort of devastating valences, and she becomes more and more kind of complex, almost impossibly complex, and then so real. I mean, but that's the sort of the sadness of the book is rooted in her. And I wondered how you experienced writing a woman who, in this character who is so complicated. How did you come at this character? How did you find her, I guess? And how did you, writing her, did you find her change in front of you, or?
You know, that just impressed me as an enormously complex question.
Use the room.
And my answer is very simple compared to the complexity of that question. My novel is called The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. And the fact is, I was on a book tour, and I would read this section, the opening section, which is about, it's the prologue, a lawyer named Tom Harrington, who is a human rights activist, and his job was to do the groundwork and the forensic work for a Truth and Justice Commission in Haiti after we invaded it. This is an actual thing that was mandated by the United Nations and funded by the US government. The more that the lawyers got the evidence and the depositions and the forensic stuff from digging up mass graves, and the closer they got to being able to present evidence of the Truth and Justice Commission, the more the United States said, stop. And then they stopped it. Now, this is not an answer to your question, but there was no Truth and Justice Commission in Haiti because the United States stopped it because they didn't want the information to be public that would come out of a hearing like that and our own involvement in the thing. This is the guy who begins my book. He's an invented character. And then I read a section of the novel where he meets the woman who lost her soul, who's introduced as Jackie Scott. And I read that section and I tell the audiences, look, some of you know I'm a journalist, and some of you know that sometimes novels are autobiographical. I'm just telling you what I first read for you was an invented character, the guy Thomas Harrington, and now I'm reading to you from real life experience, because as a journalist, I was approached by a female photojournalist, young, blonde, and infuriating, as the first line of my book says, who said, do you know about voodoo? Yes, I do. Do you know voodoo priests? Yeah, I know. I've been here a long time. I know most of them. She said, will you take me to meet a voodoo priest? And I said, yeah, okay, and let's go outside of town to one I know instead of staying here in this, crazy, polluted city. Let's go out into the countryside, which is ravaged but beautiful. And on the drive there, she was very agitated, and I asked her, what's wrong with you? And she said, can I ask you something? And so this is like reportage at this section in the novel. Can I ask you something? And I said, what? And she said, do you believe in souls? And I said, sure, why not? In the novel, the male character, has a long riff after that about what souls are and whether he believes in them. And it's not what really happened in the car, but she said, do you believe in souls? Sure, why not, I said. And then she got moody again, and she was very beautiful. She looked like a 25-year-old Meg Ryan, which was why I was with her, frankly, doing this. I was a parasite on her beauty. It even says that in the book. And I've read that passage at some places, and women have come up to me afterwards and said, you're a misogynist. I said, no. That guy is a misogynist in the book. No, but he's you. I said, no, he's not me, but actually, in that section, he is me. I wasn't a misogynist. Frankly said, I'm a parasite on this woman's beauty. But so she said, she kept, just being really tense and agitated. And I said, come on, what is wrong with you? And she said, do you think a person can lose their soul? And I said, how the fuck do I? And silence again, and her moodiness and brooding, and finally she blurted out, it's me. I said, it's you what? She said, it's me, I've lost my soul. I said, get out of here. How can you lose your soul? And then, you know, by then we had driven an hour into the countryside. We were at the Voodoo Temple. And we went inside. And what she did to me inside, I mean, that's in the book, and it's me. And then after that, it's not me anymore in the book, if you read the damn book. But she sexualizes herself.
Right.
And Amy Wilentz in damn New York Times book review said, oh, Bob's got a male fantasy going on here with this woman. It's like, excuse me, there are some women like this. There are some women like everything. Why would women be so special that they can't be one of many, 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 many things? And men the same.
Yeah, well, I think part of the joy of the book is that, and I think is what a novel can do, what other forms can't do, because of its length, is that it takes a flat person, a person who appears at first, and the way that when you meet somebody... She is
awful. When you first meet her...
She's a terrible person.
Most of the people I know who are talking to me as they're reading the book, my close friends, especially guys in the military, say, I want to kill her.
Yeah, but then by the end, you're like heartbroken at her fate.
The challenge was to present readership with a very unappealing character, in this case, a young woman, and make sure, as long as you try to hope that they'll stay with her. When I know that they hate her. I know that they hate her. It made her very unlikable. Stay with her long enough, so by the end, they are so heartbroken by that woman.
Yeah.
And so empathetic and sympathetic to that woman. That's the real challenge. That was the real challenge in that character. But she started off with, being modeled after a real person who I had met,
right.
And then a totally invented person.
Yeah, I feel like it reminds me a bit of that Philip Seymour Hoffman movie. There's been all these reminiscences about him recently. And it's specifically how he would go with these characters who are incredibly detestable. And he didn't say that they're actually misunderstood. He would say, no, yeah, everything they're doing, this person's a child molester. Indeed. But he would still insist upon their humanity. And I feel like that is, in a way, you can cue the next thing.
Well, they're not misunderstood. There's just, you are getting a slice of them. And there's a fullness to them, which does include their humanity, that they betrayed. But sometime it was there, and there was a reason why they betrayed it.
Right.
And, that's what art should explore.
Yeah. And, I mean, Milan Kundera said that the stupidity of people comes from having an answer for everything, and the wisdom of the novel comes from having a question
for everything.
And I feel like that is the challenge, and that is, I guess, what you're trying to do. But it's difficult in a book that is overtly political. Is it
overtly political?
I mean, there's a way in which there's the characters are wrapped up in political situations.
Well,
there's characters who are doing things. And I do
so are we.
Writing.
Every American is. They just refuse to acknowledge it. And because they refuse to acknowledge it, things get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
Because everybody's inert.
Yeah.
Not
making a decision is making a decision.
And you and I are part of it too. It's like you look at how huge the problems are, and even the people who are elected to solve those problems are inert.
Right.
We're all guilty of the same thing here. And that means America's in trouble. And no one particular person is to blame. We're all to blame. How we get out of it, I don't know, but now I'm being overtly political. but let me just say something. Okay, so to give a male lead here, here's a character. He's a guy, he's a humanitarian activist. As a novelist, what do you do to him? There's only one answer. You fuck him up. You make sure that the humanitarian do-gooder becomes a do-badder. And he does something that's so wrong that he questions his whole existence, all of his motivations. He even questions his own soul. But that's what a novelist has to do with a character like that. You're always flipping your characters. You take the bad person and make them a good person. You take the good person and make them a bad person. That's how always you're going to generate dramatic tension. If you're not doing that, you have within a character a sort of static or a stagnation that isn't really moving your book ahead. one last thing. I tried to write this whole book as a short story, and I couldn't write it as a short story with me meeting that woman and taking her to the voodoo temple, because she was the same at the end of the story as she was at the beginning.
Yeah.
And I guess I need a novel. and I said, I guess, 300 pages should do it.
10 years later.
Yeah, 10 years later.
This is a quote from the book, from the start of the 5th section. And this is, I guess, sort of driving at some of the sort of the way in which the politics, I feel like, are wrapped up. This is how the dead come back to us, he thinks, rotting angels, bagged and tagged and shipped home to America in the deceptively clean and shiny crates of their uselessness. There's a way in which I feel like the challenge, and you meet it very well in this book, I think it's really admirable in it, to write a political book that does not feel like it's so prescriptive or so reductive. It says it allows for opposites to exist. The character of Stephen, for example, who is so reprehensible, but you recuperate his humanity. And I wonder if you had trouble sort of trying to negotiate the politics. So I feel tempted sometimes when I'm writing, I feel tempted to get up on a soapbox and start shrieking about the things that I feel personally, but that sometimes doesn't work that well on the page. I feel like you managed to resist that while giving space to the ideas. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but it wouldn't describe my any internal conflict in me or any internal challenge. This is something that should speak to every American. Every American knows what I'm talking about here. Our coffins of our young men and women being shipped back home.
Yeah.
And, those vibrant lives are now just packaged in a crate of uselessness. That's not really political, although it gestures towards political decisions that have changed our country. But that's just us, and it's all of us. There's nobody who can call themselves an American who should be immune to the meaning of that sentence.
Right.
And I'm trying to describe our lives, and my God, we run the world, and we're running it. Some would say into the ground, and others would say we're running it into a new zone of prosperity. And look at all the lives we have saved. And there are tens of millions of lives that we have saved because of this development and this medical advancement and this sharing of it. Okay, that's the conflict between America as an imperial power that doesn't really want land, but it really wants influence. And some of its influences are not just benign, they are so idealistic, and some of them actually are triumphant, like saving, just what the Monkey King George W. Bush did with AIDS in Africa. He saved so many lives. And then what the Monkey King did in the Mideast, it will never stop.
Right.
Will never stop. And in the first novel I wrote, Swimming in the Volcano, here's the only plan I had for it that is grand. Write a novel that tries to explore how things begin. And indeed, in that novel, it stops occasionally through its pages and says, let's start again. Let's try another perspective on how things begin. How, you got punched in the mouth, it would be at the lower end of that scale. And at the higher end of that scale is, how does hatred begin? Right. And conversely, how does love begin? And in this new book, I tried to do the opposite. How do things end? How does hatred end? Is forgiveness the highest form of ending? Or not? And in this book, forgiveness is attacked as irresponsible. Because if you forgive somebody, like, okay, that guy raped me, I'll forgive him, you know, he was whatever, he had some monkey on his back, he had to rape me, I'll forgive him, we'll just go on, and I won't say anything. That's forgiveness is irresponsible. Now, the reason I wanted to explore this is because after the London subway bombings, which were after 9/11, there was a woman who was profiled in the New York Times. She was a Episcopalian minister in London. She had been a minister for 40 years, and she had always preached forgiveness like most religious people do, as the highest, most transcendent form of a person's or culture's spirituality. Her only daughter was on one of those trains that was bombed, and her only daughter was killed. And she, in the Times, was talking about, I don't think I can preach forgiveness anymore. Once she said that, from the context of her own life given over to religion and spirituality and enlightened spirituality, once reality had pushed her into that point, by exploring her character, you can explore so much about humanity, civilization, and the world. Where does the hatred stop in the Middle East? Sunnis and Shiites are killing each other as they have since the 8th century. America's going to go in there and tell them how to stop hating?
Yeah.
Really? That was our mission? That was our real mission?
Yeah, your book seems to sort of wrestle with sort of this, it spans, I think, 4 or 5 decades, at least. It starts in the 40s.
It starts at the end of
World War II. It doesn't go chronologically, it jumps around in time.
But if you ironed it out, it starts at the end of World War II.
Yeah. And so it spans this vast period of American kind of dominance, and it really wrestles with the implications of that in a way that I think you're sort of driving at now, this kind of like the responsibilities and horrors of what the United States has wrought upon the world, but also the sort of, there's a kind of nostalgia embedded in it. And you were sort of alluding to it, I think, in your talk as well. There's a kind of, the future is intriguing, but it's also frightening, especially technology, the way it's moving now.
Maybe.
Maybe. I was thinking about the Egan, the sort of the way that time is moving in our era. Like you have that quotation. I don't know if we can find digital era, love in the time of Facebook. This is the quote that you had. Our perception that we have no time is one of the distinctive marks of modern Western culture. And then Franzen, who is not a fan at all of this stuff, is sort of the chief hater of Twitter. It's the same problem everywhere. It's like the internet or cable TV. There's never any center. There's no communal agreement. There's just a trillion little bits of distracting noise, blah, 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 as you read earlier. And to me, I feel like, yet, you say elsewhere in it that the day, or in Egan says somewhere, that the days of losing touch are almost gone, for better or worse, because of Facebook. We can't quite lose touch with anyone. And the power of little voices is amplified. You look at the Arab Spring.
Is this the last quote Egan?
No, that's me
that's you.
This afternoon.
Okay.
It's increasingly difficult to be an autocrat, I think, especially the kind who wants to control speech and press and media. I feel like there's a way in which...
In Egypt, it's not difficult at all.
Yeah,
not for Putin.
Yeah, that's true. Well, they're doing
it's annoying. They're annoying.
Okay, good.
You know, they've always been annoying.
Yeah.
I don't think democracy has ever looked so bad. And it's our fault.
Interesting.
It's our fault. But what happened in Algeria in the late 80s, I think 89, I forget, because I was supposed to go to Harper's to cover those elections. And what happened was the Islamists won. Then there was 250,000 dead people later. The people who lost the election finally got control back. in Algeria. This is true about Haiti. This is true about the Gaza Strip. This is true about anywhere where America promotes the lie of democracy, but still promote the surface of democracy, which means to them one thing: voting. Hey, if people vote, they have a democracy. Well, even the military, American military, is not that stupid now. After all these fucking places they've been asked to fight to promote democracy, and they all know now a ballot box has nothing to do with it, because the people will vote one way, and America will say, "Oh, you guys voted wrong. You elected the wrong people. We want you out of there."
Yeah.
And they actively, try to subvert them or call them terrorist groups. So it's exactly as what has happened everywhere America has gone to fight for democracy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, is that what they really wanted? No, that's not what they really wanted.
Especially not during the Cold War, but even since then,
it's a bigger and bigger line,
complicated.
and the whole world knows it.
And I guess I appreciate that the book wrestles with that complexity.
I just want to wrestle with it. I don't have answers for it. But what I would really like is to have some readers in America, because we're the imperium. We're the modern imperium. Right. We are the world's power. You know this very well. And yet it doesn't seem to mean anything unless your kid has to go fight in Iraq, or your brother, or your husband, or your wife has to go fight in Iraq. Otherwise, we don't care. Right. It's not a secret that we don't care. We're very loud about not caring. Yeah. And what I wanted to do was not fight that, because I can't fight that, but what I can do is, there are millions of Americans overseas that are the centurions and the viceroys of our empire, and they're living these lives. And we just saw one of them get whacked in Benghazi. Yeah. But, there are millions of them that are like Richard and me and Holly over there and other people who have been in the Peace Corps or the Foreign Service, the State Department, the CIA, the military. We are everywhere in the world. Our influence is pervasive. And we usually get what we want, even though what we want is often not credible and not worthy of a great nation. I just want to make sure that our art 100 years from now reflects it. How can you have an empire with no 100 years after, the height of that empire, with no novels that reflect it? Right. How can you have that? Something's wrong with a culture that can't produce those works of art. And you know who's doing it pretty good? Nonfiction writers and cinematographers, but not novelists. And when there are novels like it, people don't want to read them. I don't know why, because they go to the damn movies.
I know very well what you're talking about. I think we're going to ask some, if you guys have questions among the audience, we can bring the lights up a little bit. And the crew in here, there's lights starting to emerge.
I mean, I know it's...
Give a few minutes, see if you guys want to ask.
Yeah, that's fine. I know it's Seattle, so we just have to assume you're all stoned and enlightened. But did anything I say or Peter say, was that sort of offensive, or I don't even know?
Yeah. No, I have, Priest just said a couple of things. One, it's gotten me in touch with an old crush who ironically has served multiple tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I would love it if the lights could get out of my eyes here.
Yeah, we can bring these up a little bit more.
So I can see the speaker.
The interesting thing about what you just said, that America has, or that you wish America read more, we do actually read, I think, more than a lot of nations. We don't necessarily read the big, heavy stuff. And I think, like, if we look around this room, we all read the big, heavy stuff. It's a little bit preaching to the choir. But my own crush, who served multiple duties in Iraq and Afghanistan, who I think his voice should be heard and will not, because he's kind of, I'm not going to call him a ruined soul, but he's a devastated soul right now. He's given up his family.
But he doesn't read long.
He doesn't read long. And he has a lot of complex stuff. And novel, I think, more than cinematography or anything else that deals with.
Can reach him.
That's sort of, and I feel like there's a way in which the Franzen conversation drives at that Franzen is always like, he's always saying that we should entertain more, but then everyone's saying, but then you're not entertaining. And it's this whole conversation about entertainment between him and Ben Marcus. Did you read that whole thing?
No, I'm not going to read something like that because Ben Marcus, I don't know.
I know.
But really, first you have to define what's entertainment. You know, forever, as long as there's been literature, people have considered it great entertainment, even though it was internal and pushed all the, thought buttons, intellectual buttons in your mind. I mean, great novels are really entertaining.
I just finished, I wrote a critical thesis, and a big part of it was Madame Bovary, which is immensely entertaining.
Yeah.
It is an immensely, so is Crime and Punishment, I believe.
Yeah, try putting down Anna Karenina.
Yes, exactly. But how, I guess my concern, and I don't have an answer to this, I don't know if you have an answer to this, is how do we insert that faith that this book will be entertaining into such as my own crush, who I think, that's where the voices need to come from a little bit more.
Well, you have to do that, or you can give me his email address and I'll do it. But there are a lot of, I've got a lot of friends in the military and they're all very intelligent and very well read. If you have a friend in the military, I would think that his level of intelligence, despite the myth in the general population, I would think his level of intelligence is higher than the general population would think. And, it's just like football players have to be pretty smart. You think they're pretty stupid, but they have to learn a lot to do what they do at the highest level. And it's the same with the military guys. And most I know are real readers. I got reviewed in the Miami Herald by the television critic at the Miami Herald, who was reviewing my novel, and he is a Tea Party guy. And he reluctantly wrote a positive review, and he hated himself for doing that. So at the end of it, he had an ad hominem attack, last paragraph, attacking me for being a professor who knew too many fancy words. First attack. And the second attack was, he mocked me for having soldiers who could quote T.S. Eliot. And I sent that review to a colonel I know in the Special Forces, and I said, guess what, dude? Your literacy was just demoted. And he said, yeah, me, he emailed back, me don't understand Charlotte's Web. But the fact is, almost everybody I know in the military is really literate. And in fact, this guy I'm talking about is way more literate than me. And so it can't come down to the general block categories. We have to get the military to read. Everybody I know in the military reads. And of course, there are always going to be exceptions. And so if you want to take on a crusade to get this guy to read more, there are so many great books. If you give me that are written now about the military post 9/11, novels, especially really good ones. Lee Carpenter's 11 Days, just amazing, by a civilian woman who really didn't know anything about the military. And the book is brilliant. And Ben Fountain's Billy Halftime's,
That's an amazing book.
Billy's Halftime, whatever. And I can go on and on and on with all the great work that's written that would really speak to your friend and connect with him. Because really, when you're alone and you're not feeling steady on your feet, to sit down with a good book, especially a good book that you know something about the world that's being written about, that is really a tonic on your soul. In fact, there's no better tonic on your soul. That's my opinion. But I think throughout history that's proven what literature has been one of the great ways for us to understand we're not alone. We're part of a humanity that does indeed understand us. Because we can look at them and understand them and see how we're mirrored in those experiences all the way back to Anna Karenina. can you believe in, 19th century Tsarist Russia that having an affair was an issue? Yeah. It goes all the way back to the earliest writings. You can't find literature that doesn't deal with all the problems that we're going to face as human beings throughout history for 3,000 years now. It's all there. Anybody who wants to connect with it can connect with it. You have to want to connect with it. And first you have to know that it's of value. And that's, education. But it's also peer pressure, too, to a certain extent. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here.
We're going to have one or two
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, Bob, I wanted you to talk more about...
Will,
yeah. Hey, Bob. I wanted you to talk more about Serbia, because I had no idea, so much of you with Stephen comes from Serbia, and I had no idea the deep-rooted...
You had no idea what?
About how deep-rooted the conflict is, and how, I knew a little bit about the Balkan Wars, having been a young person with them when they were on TV briefly.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was on the bus on the way here to come see you tonight, and I was talking to the old guy sitting next to me, and he went and told me about it was a Serbian that killed Ferdinand that launched World War I, which I didn't know about, and so this whole thing about, which is so much of your book about Serbia. So tell me more about Serbia.
I don't know shit about Serbia.
The main guy wasn't...
Croatia.
Croatia.
So tell what's the difference? Aren't they the same?
Well, they're Balkans.
So the Balkans, why is that so central to the conflict in your book and how it
Right, it's central because in 1457, and the date I could be wrong about, but I'm close, the Ottoman Empire's invasion of Europe, so the Muslim invasion of Europe, stopped at the gates of Vienna, Austria, and was pushed back into the Balkans. And never really ended until World War I. The Ottomans' control of southeastern Europe. And so a lot of Europeans, during those 500 years between when the Ottoman Empire's expansion was stopped at the gates of Vienna until the end of World War I, that's 500 years, a lot of the southeastern Europeans, just to get along, to go along, converted to Islam. There were still white Europeans, just like the Palestinians and the Israelis. They were basically the same people. But the Jews got kicked out of that area, and the people who remained behind became Muslim. So it was religion that divided them, and it was religion that divided the Balkans between East and West. And my only point in the book was, and the only point in focusing on the Balkans is that's where the real conflict, even though before that there are crusades that go back to forever, 7th century. The Middle Ages couldn't do anything except have monks, try to save ancient manuscripts, and kings go on crusades to kick Muslim ass. But that, as far as I know, was the only thing that happened in the Middle Ages. But so that conflict between East versus West has gone on forever. Now, because I grew up where I grew up with a Cold War warrior father inside the Beltway and knew all these players in the Cold War, for the Catholics in that Cold War conflict, and my father dropped out of the seminary 6 months before he was to be ordained as a Catholic priest and married his childhood sweetheart. For the Catholics, or for the evangelical Christians during the Cold War, I know from personal experience that once the Cold War was over, they said, good, let's get back to the real thing. And the real thing was the religious war between East and West, between people who knew who God was and the infidels, that had been going on since the Crusades. And when George Bush said, this is a crusade after 9/11, all those people went, you're the dude.
Right.
You know what you're talking about. Because this war is 1,000 years old. And we're going to kill them all this time. I know people in the government who said that. My dad was one of them. He'd just been waiting for the Cold War to get over so he could go back to the real war. And the real war was ancient. Right?
Yes. Thank you, Bob.
Somebody else just, I mean...
There were two hands up, but we
gotta go.
we're sort of running out of time. So you have questions for Bob?
I'll be on the porch.
He'll be on the porch, smoking and signing books. Also, we're going to do the raffle. Do we have a raffle list?
There's a raffle? What are we getting?
They're getting a book. You're not getting anything. But yeah, you'll be outside and...
Look, thanks so much for coming. I hope that was a good